Chapter 21. Early Manufacturing Trials. Again Henry Ford's talent for friendliness helped him. Wills, who had been working with Ford as a draftsman, came with him into the new company. He had a few $100, which he was willing to stake on Ford's ability. Couzens, who had helped organize the first company, came also, and turned his business talents to the task of raising capital to start the new concern. While he was struggling with the problems of organization, Henry Ford rented an old shack on Mack Avenue, moved his tools from the old shed, and with a couple of machinists to help him, began building his cheap cars. News of his venture spread in Detroit. The cars sold before they were built. Men found their way to the crude shop, talked to Ford in his greasy overalls, and paid down deposits on cars for future delivery. Often these deposits helped to buy material for the same cars they purchased. Ford was working on a narrow margin. Every dollar which could be squeezed from the week's earnings after expenses were paid went directly into more material for more cars. At first his machinists went home at the end of their regular hours. Then Ford worked alone far into the night building engines. Before long the men became vitally interested in Ford's success and returned after supper to help him. Meantime a few men had been found who were willing to buy stock in the new company. It was capitalized at $100,000, of which $15,000 was paid in. Then Ford set to work in earnest. The force was increased to nearly 40 men, and Wills became manager of the mechanical department. Carloads of material were ordered, on 60 days' time, every pound of iron or inch of wire calculated with the utmost nicety, so that each shipment would be sufficient to build a certain number of completed cars without the waste of 10 cents worth of material. Then Ford and Couzens set out to sell the cars before payment for the material came due. Ford set a price of $900 a car, an amount which he figured would cover the cost of material, wages, and overhead, and leave a margin for buying more material. 1,000 anxieties now filled his days and nights. $15,000 was very little money for his plant. Wages alone would eat it up in 10 weeks. The raw material must be made into cars, sold, and the money collected before it could be paid for. Many times a check from a buyer won the race with the bill from the foundry by a margin of hours. Often on payday Ford faced the prospect of being unable to pay the men until he should have sold a shipment of cars not yet built. But the cars sold. Their simplicity of construction, their power, above all their cheapness, in a day when automobiles almost without exception sold for $2,500 to $4,000, brought buyers. In a few weeks orders came from Cleveland for them. Shortly afterward a dealer in Chicago wrote for an agency there. Still, the success of the venture depended from week to week on 1,000 chances. Ford, with his genius for factory management, reduced the waste of material or labor to the smallest minimum. He worked on new designs for simpler, cheaper motors. He figured orders for material. His own living expenses were cut to the bone. Every cent of profit on sales went into the factory. Nearly 1,000 cars were sold that year, but with the beginning of winter sales decreased, almost stopped. The factory must be kept running in order to have cars for the spring trade. Close figuring would enable them to keep it open, but an early brisk market would be necessary to save the company in the spring. In this emergency Ford recalled the great advertising value of racing. He had designed a 4-cylinder car to be put on the market the following year. If he could make a spectacular demonstration of 4-cylinder construction as compared with the old motors, the success of his spring sales would be assured. Ford announced that in November he would try for the world's speed record in a 4-cylinder car of his own construction. The old machine in which Barney Oldfield had made his debut as an automobile driver was brought out and overhauled. The body was rebuilt so that in form it was much like the racing cars of today. Ford himself remodeled the motor. The test was to be made on the frozen surface of Lake St. Clair. The course was surveyed. On the appointed day, with Ford himself as driver, the motor car appeared for its second trial. A stiff wind was blowing over the ice. The surface of the lake, apparently smooth, was in reality seamed with slight crevices and roughened with frozen snow. Ford, muffled in a fur coat, with a fur cap pulled down over his ears, went over it anxiously, noting mentally the worst spots. Then he cranked the car, settled himself in the seat, and nodded to the starter. The signal came. Ford threw on the power and was off. The car, striking the ice fissure, leaped into the air, 2 wheels at a time. Ford, clinging to the tiller, was almost thrown from his seat. Zigzagging wildly, bouncing like a ball, the machine shot over the ice. Twice it almost upset, but Ford, struggling to keep the course, never shut down the power. He finished the mile in 39 1/5 seconds, beating the world's record by 7 seconds. The success of next year's sales was certain. The following day, when Ford reached the factory, Wills met him with an anxious face. It was pay day and there was no money. "We didn't bother you about it last week because you were so busy with the race," Wills said. "We thought up to the last minute that the check from Chicago would come. It was due 2 days ago. We wired yesterday and got no answer. Mr. Couzens left this morning on the early train to find out what is wrong. You know how it is. The men want their money for over Christmas. The blank company wants men, and they're offering more money than we can pay. I'm afraid our men will quit, and if they do and we can't get out the Cincinnati order next week." Ford knew that to raise more money from the stockholders would be impossible. They had gone in as deeply as they could. To sacrifice a block of his own stock would be to lose control of the company, and besides it would be difficult to sell it. The company was still struggling for existence. It had paid no dividends, and other automobile manufacturers were already paying the enormous profits that led in the next few years to wild, disastrous expansion in the automobile business. The Ford company had no marketable assets, nothing but the rented building, the equipment, and a few unfilled orders. "Well, if we pull through the men will have to do it," said Ford. "I'll tell them about it." That evening, when the day's work was over and the men came to the office to get their pay, they found Ford standing in the doorway. He said he had something to tell them. When they had all gathered in a group, nearly 100 by this time, he stood on a chair so that all of them could hear what he had to say, and told them the exact situation. "Now, men, we can pull through all right if you'll help out now," he concluded. "You know the kind of car we're selling, and the price, and you know what the new one did yesterday. We can get through the winter on our unfinished orders if we never get that Chicago check. Next year we'll have a big business. But it all depends on you. If you quit now we're done for. What about it, will you stay?" "Sure, Mr. Ford." "You bet we will, old man." "We're with you, don't you forget it," they said. Before they left the plant most of them came up to assure him personally that they would stand by the Ford company. Next day they all arrived promptly for work, and during the week they broke all previous records in the number of cars turned out. "War between capital and labor is just like any other kind of war," Henry Ford says today. "It happens because people do not understand each other. The boss ought to show his books to his employees, let them see what he's working for. They're just as intelligent as he is, and if he needs help they'll turn in and work 24 hours a day if they have to keep the business going. More than that, they'll use their heads for him. They'll help him in hundreds of ways he never would think of. The only trouble is that people make a distinction between practical things and spiritual qualities. I tell you, loyalty and friendliness and helping the other man along are the only really valuable things in this world, and they bring all the practical advantages along with them every time. If every one of us had the courage to believe that and act on it, war and waste and misery of all kinds would be wiped out overnight. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Automobiles for the Masses. In a short time Couzens returned from Chicago, bringing not only the delayed check, but several orders as well, which he had obtained largely because of the astounding record made by the Ford car in its race over the ice on Lake St. Clair. The Ford Company was not yet firmly established, but prospects were bright. America was awaking to the possibilities of the automobile, not merely as a machine for spectacular exhibitions of daring and skill at track meetings, or as the plaything of wealthy men, but as a practical time and labor saver for the average person. The automobile industry rose almost overnight. Orders poured into the offices of companies already organized. New companies were formed by dozens, capitalized at millions of dollars. Fly-by-night concerns sprang up like mushrooms, flooded the country with stock-selling schemes, established factories where parts of motor cars bought elsewhere were assembled. Fortunes were made and lost and made again. Almost every day saw new cars on the market. Everyone wanted an automobile. It was a luxury. It appealed to our longing to have something just a little better than our neighbors could afford. At the same time, its obvious usefulness was an argument which overcame economy. The comic supplements, those faithful reflectors of American life in terms of the ridiculous, played with every variation of the theme. He mortgaged the home to buy an automobile. Amid this mounting excitement, in spite of millions to be made by building a car bigger, finer, more beautiful and luxurious than those of his competitors, Henry Ford still clung firmly to his idea. He seems to have been at that time the only automobile manufacturer who realized that the automobile supplied a real need of the average man, and that the average man is a hard-working, frugal individual used to living without those things he must mortgage his home to get. The automobile of those days was like a steam yacht, Ford says. It was built for only a few people. Now anything that is good for only a few people is really no good. It's got to be good for everybody, or in the end it will not survive. Radical philosophy, that. You might hear it from a street corner orator, one of that dissatisfied multitude which will insist, in spite of all the good things we have in this country, that merely because those things are not good for them, they are not good. There is something of Marx in such a statement, something of George Washington, even something of Christianity. No wonder men were astounded by the notion that success could be founded on a theory like that. "It's plain common sense, I tell you," Ford insisted, and in spite of good advice, in spite of sound business reasoning, that obstinate man went on in his own way and acted on that belief. The Ford cars were cheap. Already underpriced nearly $1,000 in comparison with other cars, they were to be sold still cheaper, Ford insisted. Every cent he could save in construction, in factory management, in shrewd buying of material was deducted from the selling price. The cars sold. Orders accumulated faster than they could be filled in the shop on Mack Avenue. The profits went back into the factory. More men were added to the payroll, more machinery was installed, and still the orders came and the output could not keep up with them. Mrs. Ford could afford to buy her own hats instead of making them, to get a new set of furniture for the parlor, to purchase as many gloves and shoes as she wanted. She did these things. She even talked of getting a hired girl to do the cooking. But Ford himself made little change in his way of living. He had always dressed warmly and comfortably, eaten when he was hungry, slept soundly enough on an ordinary bed. He saw no way to increase his comforts by spending more money on himself. "More than enough money to keep him comfortable is no use to a man," he says. "You can't squander money on yourself without hurting yourself. Money's only a lubricant to keep business going." He continued to work hard, designing simpler, cheaper cars, struggling with business difficulties as they arose, planning a new factory. Most of all he was interested in the new factory. The success of his four-cylinder car provided money enough to warrant building it at last. A small tract of land on Piquette Avenue was bought, and Ford prepared to move from the rented Mack Avenue place. The watch factory dream was finally to be realized. Henry Ford declared that by a large equipment of special machinery and a sympathetic organization of the work, cars could be produced at a hitherto unheard of price. He planned to the smallest detail, to the most minute fraction of space, time, labor, the production of those cars. Every part was to be machined to exact size. No supplementary fitting in the assembling room was to be necessary. From the time the raw iron entered one end of the factory till the finished car rolled away from the other end, there was not to be a moment's delay, a wasted motion. The various parts, all alike to the fraction of an inch, were to fit together with automatic precision, and Ford announced that he would produce 10,000 cars in a single year. The manufacturing world was stunned by the announcement. Then it laughed. Very few people believed that Ford would go far with such a radical departure from all accepted practice. But the new building was finished. Ford installed his machinery according to his plans, and when the wheels began to turn, the world learned a new lesson in efficiency. Still, Ford's success in the automobile field was not easily won. As a poor, hard-working mechanic, he had fought weariness and poverty and ridicule to build his motor car. As an unknown inventor, still poor, he had struggled for a foothold in the business world and got it. Now he was in for a long, expensive legal battle before he should be able to feel secure in his success. The Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, a combination of 73 of the biggest motor car companies, brought suit against the Ford Company to recover tremendous sums of money because of Ford's alleged violation of the Selden patent. Selden held a basic patent covering the use of the gasoline engine as motive power in self-propelled vehicles. When automobiles began to be put on the market, he claimed his right under that patent to a royalty on all such vehicles. Other automobile manufacturers, almost without exception, acceded to his claim and operated under a lease from him, adding the royalty to the selling price. Henry Ford balked. He had been running a self-propelled gasoline engine long before Selden had applied for his patent. Furthermore, the royalties interfered with the long-cherished dream of cheapening his cars. He flatly refused to make the payments. The lessees of the Selden rights, perceiving in Ford a dangerous adversary in the automobile field, who would become still more dangerous if he succeeded in eliminating the royalty payments from his manufacturing costs, immediately began to fight him with all the millions at their command. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23. Fighting the Selden Patent. By sheer force of an idea, backed only by hard work, Henry Ford had established a new principle in mechanics. He had created new methods in the manufacturing world, methods substantially those which prevail in manufacturing today. Now he entered the legal field. His fight on the Selden patent, a fight that lasted nearly 10 years, was a sensation not only in the automobile world, but among lawyers everywhere. The intricacies of the case baffled the jurists before whom it was tried. Time and again, decisions adverse to Ford were handed down. Each time Ford came back again, more determined than before, carried the contest to a higher court, and fought the battle over again. On one side, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers was struggling to save patent rights for which they had paid vast sums of money, to maintain high prices for automobiles, and to protect their combination of manufacturing interests. On the other, Ford was fighting to release the industry from paying tribute to a patent which he believed unsound, to smash the combination of manufacturers, and to keep down his own factory costs so that he could make a still cheaper car. With the first adverse decision, the ALAM carried the fight into the newspapers. Most of us can recall the days when from coast to coast the newspapers of America blossomed with page advertisements warning people against buying Ford cars, asserting that every owner of a Ford car was liable to prosecution for damages under the Selden patent rights. Those were chaotic years in the industry. The hysteria which followed the huge profit-making of the first companies checked only temporarily by the panic of 1907 to '08, mounted again in a rising wave of excitement. Dozens of companies sprang up, sold stock, assembled a few cars, and went down in ruin. Buyers of their cars were left stranded with automobiles for which they could not get new parts. It was asserted that the Ford Motor Company, unable to pay the enormous sums accruing if the Selden patent was upheld, would be one of the companies to fail. Buyers were urged to play safe by purchasing a recognized car, a car made by the licensed manufacturers. Ford, already involved in a business fight against the association and its millions, thus found himself in danger of losing the confidence of the public. The story of those years is one which cannot be adequately told. Ford was working harder than he had ever done while he was building his first car in the old shed. He was one of the first men at the factory every morning, and long after Detroit was asleep he was still hard at work, conferring with lawyers, discussing with cousins the latest disaster that threatened, struggling with business problems, meeting emergencies in the selling field, and always planning to better the factory management and to lower the price and increase the efficiency of the car. The car sold. Ford had built it for common men, for the vast body of America's middle-class people, and it was cheap enough to be within their reach. Ford knew that if he could keep their confidence, he could win in the end. He met the attack of the ALAM by printing huge advertisements, guaranteeing purchasers of his car from prosecution under the Selden patents, and backed his guarantee by the bond of a New York security company. Then he appealed the patent case and kept on fighting. In 1908 the farmer boy, who had started out 20 years before with nothing but his bare hands and an idea, found himself at the head of one of America's largest business organizations. That year his factory made and sold 6,398 cars. Every machine sold increased his liabilities in case he lost the patent fight, but the business was now on a firm foundation. Agencies had been established in all parts of the world, orders came pouring in, profits were rolling up. Ford found his net earnings increasing faster than he could possibly put them back into the business. At the end of that year he and cousins sat in their offices going over the balance sheets of the company. The size of the bank balance was most satisfactory. The factory was running to the limit of its capacity. Orders were waiting. Prospects were bright for the following season. Ford leaned back in his chair. "Well, I guess we're out of the woods all right," he said. He put his hands in his pockets and looked thoughtfully at the ceiling. "Remember that time in the Mack Avenue place," he began, "when that Chicago check didn't come in and we couldn't pay the men?" "I should say I do. And the day we got the first order from Cleveland. Remember how you worked in the shop yourself to get it out?" "And you hustled out and got material on 60 days' time? And the boys worked all night, and we had to wait till the money came from Cleveland before we could give them their overtime? That was a great bunch of men we had then." They began to talk them over. Most of them were managers of departments now. One was handling the sales force. Another had developed into a driver and won many trophies and broken many records with the Ford car. Wills was superintendent of the factory. "I tell you, cousins, you and I have been at the head of the concern, and we've done some big things together, but if it hadn't been for the men we'd be a long way from where we are today," Ford said at last. "Now we have some money we don't need for the business, we ought to divide with them. Let's do it." "I'm with you," Couzens said heartily, and reached for his pencil. Eagerly as two boys, they sat there for another hour figuring. They began with checks for the men they remembered, men who had been with them in the first days of the company, men who had done some special thing which won their notice, men who were making good records in the shops or on the sales force. But there seemed no place to draw the line. "After all, every man who's working for us is helping," Ford decided. "Let's give every one of them a Christmas present," Couzens agreed. "We'll have the clerical department figure it out. The men who have been with us longest the most, and so on down to the last errand boy that's been with us a year. What do you say?" Ford said yes with enthusiasm, and so it was settled. That year every employee of the company received an extra check in his December pay envelope. Ford had reached a point in his business life where he must stop and consider what he should do with the money his work had brought him, and those extra checks were the first result. For 20 years Ford had spent all his energy, all his time and thought in one thing, his work. If he had divided his interests, if he had allowed a liking for amusement, ease, finer clothes, admiration, to hinder his work in the old shed, he would never have built his car. If he had cared more for personal pleasure and applause than he did for his idea, he would have allowed his factory plan to be altered, twisted out of shape and forgotten when he first found capital to manufacture the car. But from the day he left his farm till now, he has subordinated everything else to his machine idea. He applied it first to an engine, then to a factory. He fought through innumerable difficulties to make those ideas into realities. He destroyed old conceptions of mechanics and of factory management. He built up a great financial success. Now he found himself with a new problem to face, the problem of a great fortune piling up in his hands. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The greatest good to the greatest number. The response to that first Christmas gift from the Ford Company to its employees was another proof of Ford's theory that friendliness pays. In the following month the production of cars broke all January records. Salesmen, with a new feeling of loyalty to the firm, increased their efforts, worked with greater enthusiasm, and their orders jumped. The fight with the association still raged in the courts and in the newspapers, but the factory wheels were turning faster than ever before. More cars were pouring out, more people were buying. That year the Ford organization made and sold 10,607 cars. Ford had made good his prophecy that the new factory would produce 10,000 cars in 1 year. The phenomenal growth of his business had begun. His own fortune was doubling and doubling again. America had produced another self-made millionaire. Ford himself believes that anyone who will pay the price he has paid can make a financial success as great. "Poverty doesn't hold a man down," he says. "Money doesn't amount to anything. It has no real value whatever. Any young man who has a good idea and works hard enough will succeed. Money will come to him. What do I mean by a good idea? I mean an idea that will work out for the best interests of everyone, an idea for something that will benefit the world. That's the kind of an idea the world wants." This country has produced hundreds of men whose lives prove this statement, men who have built railroads, telephones, telegraph systems, great merchandising organizations. These men have subordinated every personal pleasure to their work. They have exhausted their minds and bodies, driven themselves mercilessly, used every ounce of energy and ability, and won. The tragedy for them and for our country is that in winning the fight most of them have lost their perspective on it. They themselves have become absorbed by the machine they have built up. The money they have amassed usually means very little to them, but business is their passion. With millions upon millions piling up to their credit, they continue to hold down wages, to protect their profits, to keep the business running as it has always run. That business has been built only because fundamentally it was for the greatest good to the greatest number, but in the long fight they have lost sight of that fact. Let a new project arise which is for the general good and "it will hurt business," they cry in alarm. Ford kept his viewpoint, partly because of his years on the farm, where he worked shoulder to shoulder with other men and learned essential democracy, partly because most of his work had been in mechanics rather than in business, but most of all because he is a simple, straight-thinking man. The tremendous Ford organization did not absorb him. He had applied his machine idea first to an engine, then to a factory. In time he was to apply it to society as a whole. "That Christmas present of ours is paying better dividends than any money we ever spent," he said to Couzens with a grin. First thing we know, the men'll be paying us back more than we gave them. Look here." He spread on Couzens's desk a double handful of letters from the men. "They like it," he said soberly. "Some of them say they were worrying about Christmas bills and so on. Those checks took a load off their minds, and they're pitching in and working hard to show they appreciate it. I guess in the long run anything that is good for the men is good for the company." In the months that followed he continued to turn over in his mind various ideas which occurred to him, based on that principle. The Ford employees and agents now numbered tens of thousands. They were scattered all over the earth, from Bombay to Nova Scotia, Switzerland, Peru, Bermuda, Africa, Alaska, India. Everywhere were workers, helping Ford. Black men in turbans, yellow men in embroidered robes, men of all races and languages, speaking, thinking, living in ways incomprehensible to that quiet man who sat in his office in Detroit, were part of the vast machine out of which his millions poured. He thought it over, that great machine. He knew machines. He knew that the smallest part of one was as necessary as the largest, that every nut and screw was indispensable to the success of the whole. And while he brooded over the mighty machine his genius had created, the thought slowly formed itself in his mind that those multiplying millions of his were the weak spot in the organization. Those millions represented energy, and through him they were draining out of the machine, accumulating in a useless, idle store. Some way they must be put back. "Everybody helps me," he said. "If I'm going to do my part, I must help everybody." A new problem filled his mind. How should he put his money back into that smooth, efficient organization in such a way as to help all parts of it without disorganizing it? It was now a part of the business system of the world, founded on financial and social principles which underlie all society. It was no small matter to alter it. Meantime there were immediate practical necessities to be met. His business had far outgrown the Piquette Avenue plant. A new factory must be built. He bought a tract of 276 acres in the northern part of Detroit and began to plan the construction of his present factory, a number of huge buildings covering more than 47 acres. In this mammoth plant Ford had at last the opportunity, unhampered by any want of capital, to put into operation his old ideas of factory management. Here 1,800 men were to work, quickly, efficiently, without the loss of a moment or a motion, all of them integral parts of one great machine. Each department makes one part of the Ford car, complete, from raw material to the finished product, and every part is carried swiftly and directly, by gravity, to the assembling room. But Ford's new idea also began to express itself here. He meant to consider not only the efficiency, but the happiness and comfort of his men. The walls were made of plate glass, so that every part of the workrooms were light and well ventilated. One whole department, employing 500 men, was established to do nothing but sweep floors, wash windows, look after sanitary conditions generally. The floors are scrubbed every week with hot water and alkali. 25 men are employed constantly in painting the walls and ceilings, keeping everything fresh and clean. That winter the Christmas checks went again to all the employees. Ford was still working out a real plan by which his millions could help. Meantime he divided his profits in this makeshift fashion. The following year the company moved to its new quarters. In that atmosphere of light and comfort the men worked better than ever before. Production broke another record. 38,528 cars in 1 year were made and sold. "And the automobile world is waiting to hear the next announcement from Henry Ford," said a trade journal at that time. Whether or not he has another sensation in store is the livest topic of discussion in Detroit manufacturing circles, nay, even throughout the world. Henry Ford was preparing another sensation, but this time it was to be in a larger field. He had startled the world first with a motor car, next with a factory. Now he was thinking of broad economic problems. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. $5 a day minimum. The Selden patent fight had continued through all the early years of Ford's struggle to establish himself in business. At last it was settled. Ford won it. The whole industry was freed from an oppressive tax, and his long fight was over. Immediately, of course, other cars came into the low-priced field. Other manufacturers, tardily following Ford, began the downward pressure in prices which now makes it possible for thousands of persons with only moderate means to own automobiles. For the first time Ford faced competition in his own price class. Innumerable business problems confronted the farmer mechanic from the time he opened his office doors in the early morning until the last workman had left the plant and only his light was burning. Businessmen came, financiers, salesmen, lawyers, designers. Every day for 2 hours he conferred with his superintendents and foremen in the main factory. Every detail of the business was under his supervision. A smaller man, or a less simple one, would have been absorbed by the sheer mass of work. Ford settled every problem by his own simple rule. Do what is fundamentally best for everybody. It will work out for our interests in the end. And always he was pondering the big problem of putting back into active use the millions that were accumulating to his credit. Every year the price was lowered on his cars, following his original policy of making the automobile cheap. Still the sales increased by leaps and bounds, and his margin of profit on each car mounted into a greater total. "The whole system is wrong," he says. "People have the wrong idea of money. They think it is valuable in itself. They try to get all they can, and they've built up a system where one man has too much and another not enough. As long as that system is working there does not seem any way to even things up. But I made up my mind to do what I could." Money valuable? I tell you, gold is the least valuable metal in the world. Edison says it is no good at all. It is too soft to make a single useful article. Suppose there was only one loaf of bread in the world. Would all the money on earth buy it from the man who had it? Money itself is nothing, absolutely nothing. It is only valuable as a transmitter, a method of handling things that are valuable. The minute one man gets more of it than he can use to buy the real things he needs, the surplus is sheer waste. It is stored up energy that is no good to anybody. Every bit of energy that is wasted that way hurts the whole world, and in the end it hurts the man who has it as much as it hurts anybody. Look here, you make a machine to do something useful, don't you? Well then, if it is built so that it keeps wasting energy, doesn't the whole machine wear itself out without doing half as much as it should? Isn't that last energy bad for every part of the machine? Well, that is the way the world is running now. The whole system is wrong. A very little thought brings almost any of us to that conclusion, especially if the thinker is one whose surplus money is all in the other man's bank account. But Ford held to that thought, as few of us would, with the surplus millions in his own hands. Furthermore, he proposed not merely to think, but to act on that thought. He is not a man to act hastily. Before he made his engine he worked out the drawings. Before he distributed his money he selected 200 men from the workers in his shop and sent them out to learn all they could of the living conditions of the other thousands. They worked for a year, and at the end of that time Ford, going carefully over their reports, saw plainly where his surplus money should go. Over 4,000 of the 18,000 men working in the Ford plant were living in dire poverty and unspeakable home conditions. Families were huddled into tenements, where in wet weather water stood on the floor. Wives were ill, uncared for, babies were dressed in rags. Another 5,000 men in his employ were living in conditions which could only be called fair. Only 364 out of 18,000 owned their own homes. Yet the employees in the Ford shops were above the average of factory working men. They were paid the regular scale of wages, not overworked, and their surroundings at the plant were sanitary and pleasant. In those terrible figures Ford was seeing merely the ordinary, accustomed result of the wasted energy represented in those idle millions of dollars. He went over them thoroughly, noting that the scale of living grew steadily better as the salaries increased, observing that the most wretched class was mainly composed of foreign workmen, ignorant, unskilled labor, most of them unable to speak English. He figured, thought, drew his own conclusions. He had been studying relief plans, methods of factory management in Germany, welfare work of all kinds. When he had finished his consideration of those reports, he threw overboard all the plans other people had made and announced his own. "Every man who works for me is going to get enough for a comfortable living," he said. "If an able-bodied man can't earn that, he's either lazy or ignorant. If he's lazy, he's sick. We'll have a hospital. If he's ignorant, he wants to learn. We'll have a school. Meantime, figure out in the accounting bureau a scale of profit sharing that will make every man's earnings at least $5 a day. The man that gets the smallest wages gets the biggest share of the profits. He needs it most." On January 12, 1914, Ford more than satisfied the expectant manufacturers of the world. He launched into the industrial world a most startling bombshell. "$5 a day for every workman in the Ford factory? He's crazy," other manufacturers said aghast. "Why, those dirty, ignorant foreigners don't earn half that. You can't run a business that way." "That man Ford will upset the whole industrial situation. What is he trying to do, anyhow?" they demanded when every Detroit factory workman grew restless. The news spread rapidly. Everywhere workers dropped their tools and hurried to the Ford factory. $5 a day! When Ford reached the factory in the morning of the second day after his announcement, he found Woodward Avenue crowded with men waiting to get a job in the shops. An hour later the crowds had jammed into a mob, which massed outside the buildings and spread far into adjoining streets, pushing, struggling, fighting to get closer to the doors. It was not safe to open them. That mass of humanity, pushed from behind, would have wrecked the offices. The manager of the employment department opened a window and shouted to the frantic crowd that there were no jobs, but the sound of his voice was lost in the roar that greeted him. He shut the window and telephoned the police department for reserves. Still the crowds increased every moment by new groups of men wildly eager to get a job which would pay them a comfortable living. Ford looked down at them from his window. "Can't you make them understand we haven't any jobs?" he asked the employment manager. The man, disheveled, breathing hard, and hoarse with his efforts to make his voice heard, shook his head. "The police are coming," he said. "Then there'll be somebody hurt," Ford predicted. "We can't have that. Get the fire hose and turn it on the crowd. That will do the business." A moment later a solid 2-inch stream of water shot from the doors of the Ford factory. It swept the struggling men half off their feet, knocked the breath from their bodies, left them gasping, startled, dripping. They scattered. In a few moments the white stream from the hose was sweeping back and forth over a widening space bare of men. When the police arrived the crowd was so dispersed that the men in uniform marched easily through it without using their clubs. For a week a special force of policemen guarded the Ford factory, turning back heartsick men, disappointed in their hope of a comfortable living wage. It was a graphic illustration of the harm done the whole machine by the loss of energy stored in money, held idle in the hands of a few men. End of chapter 25.